Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. Today is a Comprehensivist Wednesday, and we are looking at The Birth of Tragedy by Nietzsche. It's wonderful to have Phil back, and I'm just going to hand it over to Phil. So, Phil, how are we going to cover this? If you could give a little bit about the format.
Well, yeah, so what I like about Nietzsche is that he packs a lot of stuff into very short, concise sentences. And so his ideas are so deep and profound that it's very easy to discuss them kind of one by one, as opposed to opening the fire hydrant and just, inundating the audience with a full range of these ideas. Maybe it's best to take them one at a time and just see how far we get. So I think, if you've read first part of The Birth of Tragedy, then I think we can just kind of take it from the beginning and go through some of the high points, or at least what I thought were some of the high points, and then we can open it up to the rest of the group and see if they have their own take on it, or maybe some of the things I missed. So yeah.
Sounds good. All right, let's continue. Go ahead.
All right, so Birth of Tragedy is possibly, I think it's the first published work by Nietzsche. So this is the first public voice of his that we have. And as always, the first and the last are the important things. And I think especially for a person who, essentially, you have the sort of the bloom of their career. They're in their prime. They've just finished, their course of study, and Nietzsche was at this point. He has not kind of seen the bitterness of a reception of his viewpoints yet. So he just finished his doctorate, and he started delivering a few lectures, and his friends convinced him to put these lectures into book form, into like a long essay, basically. And The Birth of Tragedy, full name is Birth of Tragedy, from the Spirit of Music, which in itself is a very interesting thing we can talk about. And of course, Nietzsche develops this idea, is a book that on the face of it deals with, this phenomenon of Greek tragedy and how it arose, and some ideas about its synthesis and how it developed. But really, underneath all of this is this absolutely spectacular, deep, profound discussion of really pivotal points in Western philosophy and our lives, really. And so right from the start, I want to suggest that Nietzsche almost maybe unconsciously used this work as a pretext to discuss much deeper things. And of course, they all come out. I mean, if you know Nietzsche's writing, a lot of the ideas that come out later in his philosophical writing, they're all kind of the seeds of those ideas are all planted here. I mean, you can trace so easily a lot of his thoughts and feelings. And it's interesting that in the edition I have, he wrote an intro to this work, which was written, I think, 12 or 14 years later. And it says, even though this was a work that was by any means imperfect, and I'm not happy about some things about it, but the views themselves have not changed. So this really has, when you read this work, you know that you're reading kind of the core set of Nietzsche's convictions and beliefs. And it's interesting in that right as well. So from the get-go, the question is posed to us about the role of pessimism and optimism as motivating forces in a culture. And I love this setting, because in American culture, to question the idea of optimism as something good and as anything but a symptom of vitality seems crazy. and the opposite of it, pessimism seems is associated with weakness, with old age, with some sort of malaise, perhaps. But Nietzsche completely overturns that he poses it as a question first, and then he proceeds to overturn this idea. And he says that optimism is, in fact, a symptom of decay. And it's interesting then that he proceeds to talk about science as a pragmatic expression of that optimism. So the optimism is in this idea of improving our condition, improving our lives through some sort of technical means and so on. And science and knowledge and being able to apprehend the world around us. All of these things we've completely taken for granted. We do take them for granted because we live in a scientific world which prides itself on being able to control and manipulate and understand everything around us. And Nietzsche says, okay, that's all great, but here is my thesis. A world, a culture, a civilization that has this characteristic of optimism is never going to produce a tragedy, or a type of tragedy, a type of artistic work, if we put it a little bit wider, that we've seen with the Greeks. And then he proceeds to dissect that and get into the meat of this argument. So I want to stop here to see if there's any, before I get into the rest of it, or the sort of the next thoughts, are there any thoughts that you have, Shrikant?
Sure. Sure. So folks, this is what we're going to do. We want to do it in a very interactive way. So first I want to say that, Phil, you come from Russia. So pessimism is the more just as optimism is common here, I think pessimism is common there. And it's very interesting thing about cultures that I found when I immigrated from India to here is that a whole bunch of worldviews that are taken for granted as the normal thing in one place are actually very different in another place. They have views which they consider that this is the normal way of being, but it's completely different. So I think America and Russia as being kind of examples of optimism and pessimism is very, very interesting. So we can focus on just the theme of optimism and pessimism and what are the consequences of it. So everybody's welcome to comment. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you'd like to comment. Keep your comments brief because we want to go through this entire part, but so be concise. Go ahead. We're going to start with Sarah. Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just wanted to I want to make a brief comment. I studied philosophy in college. I double majored in it with political science. And we didn't really focus Nietzsche came later on. We started with Aristotle, Hobbes, Rousseau, you name it. And so the way I think Nietzsche is literally from what I've studied, is probably among the most brilliant thinkers that has ever walked the earth. So I guess and it's funny because the way he was introduced into my my studies was through existentialism. So I took a course in existentialism, and so he's categorized as an existentialist. But it's funny because this is the one book of his that I honestly did not dig too deep into. I wrote papers on several of his books. Thus Spoke Zarathustra was my Bible, so to speak, for years in college. And Human All Too Human, I actually have that book on me right now. Existentialism is a Humanism. Is it the Gay Science, I believe? And so I guess I'm curious to see if you guys would be able to point in these writings with what you're kind of taking, what your thoughts are on it, so that I can go back and think and kind of keep your perspective in mind as I read it, as I reread it, I should say. Because I took it, I read it, and I took it for what I took it as, but I'd like to hear your guys' perspective. And if you could, and I know you're directing the class, so if you could kind of briefly point out where in the book you're kind of getting what you're saying as we do.
Oh, sure, as we go through. Yeah, this is just, I'm taking it, so we've read first 13 sections of
but
it.
I mean, just as you're saying, as I'm going to step out of the picture now, but as we continue.
Right. Yeah, of course, sure. I can try to do that as much as I can. So
so your optimism and pessimism dichotomy, where did you find that in the right? Just so that I can kind of.
Oh yeah, well, okay, so let me see.
let's not get too pedantic, Sarah. What we'll do is that we expect that it's all there. You can go ahead and look it up. It should be very easy to do that. I don't want to take time of the discussion on that. It's a valid thing. What I would recommend.
So you guys are going to pick out major themes throughout the class that you found in the writings, and then it's up to us to find. Okay.
Exactly.
Got it.
So what happens?
I'll try to point out if I have, he doesn't have like verses, and the pages are all different. But I would say that the first couple of sections deals exactly with this topic of optimism.
Appreciate it. And it's so interesting that this meetup group is applicable, is available and accessible to every single person on the planet. And it happens to be us in this class discussing, who I honestly would argue is one of the greatest thinkers that has ever walked the earth. So it's good to be with you guys. But thank you so much. And
thank you, Sarah. So folks, what we do, I mean, this is a style that we use in 52 Living Ideas a lot. What we do is that people who are presenting kind of look at the text as a whole and try to kind of glean from it what the major themes are. And they talk about it and they initiate the discussion. Now, people who have read the text can immediately see, oh, you know what, that is the main theme. And then some people will come and say, look, this too is a main theme, or this is what I think about the main theme. So, and then what happens is that, what we're doing is actually it's a very odd thing. This is kind of part of the scribal tradition. Like, everybody is expected to be reading things, and then there is discussion that is taking place on the top of
right. But I guess what I was trying to say was
and what we do is that when we want to speak, just go ahead and type exclamation mark, and we will go back.
Right.
Yes.
If there's anything specific that has been written, so if you're using words that he has used, can you just all I'm asking for is to zero in on like the section.
Sure.
And if you're not using words, it gets kind of convoluted, because then I'm trying to, I thought, we're analyzing his writings, and then I just kind of make it clear if it's your personal perspective on where he went with it, or what, or if it's more specific. That's all I could.
Thank you, Sarah. Look, we have 4 rules. Number 1, when you want to speak, go ahead and type exclamation mark, and then I will call on people. So let's not interrupt each other when we're speaking. That's rule number 1. Rule number 2, we'll keep on topic, okay, and we'll try to be concise so we can cover the entire depth of what we are doing. But the interesting thing is that the scribal tradition is all about everybody communing with the text themselves, having ideas about it, and then talking about it, and then going back and taking the test, so going back to the text themselves. So it's a very much of a kind of self-driven on one hand. Its idea is that of a joint exploration of this great work. Next up is going to be Madhav. Madhav, go ahead.
Could you quickly explain how optimism and pessimism are used? Does by optimism he mean any expression of a hopeful future?
No, I mean, again, I am, to Sarah's point, I am relating Nietzsche's ideas as he presented them. So for optimism, obviously, it's a very word that is very general, and I don't think Nietzsche uses it in its general sense of anything that's hopeful or optimistic. Otherwise, it becomes kind of an unrealistic and somewhat unworkable. But in general, think of it not as not in its simplistic sort of naive interpretation, but more as an outlook that says we can essentially control the world, and we can whatever things that are wrong with the world, we can ultimately get a fix on it and control it. And optimism in that sense is linked with 2 things. One is science as a way of knowing the world through knowledge, specifically. And the second is an outgrowth of that, which is technology. And what's interesting to me is, these ideas right from the outset of suffering, reality of the world, and how one deals with that, they're all picked up by Oswald Spengler in his work on the decline of the West. And his points are, he agrees with Nietzsche. He basically says a culture that is focused on science is a culture in decline. Again, this is his viewpoint. I'm not saying it's my viewpoint. It's not like I'm just describing some connections that are interesting to explore. So Spengler agrees with Nietzsche. He says that a culture that is primarily aesthetic, artistic, is a culture in its youth, in its prime, in its sort of vigor, in its energy, at the top of its game, which is not what we would typically, say. We tend to look at it from a technological standpoint. Archaeologists, scientists, typically they'll say, well, this is an advanced culture because it uses these advanced tools, versus this is a more primitive culture because it doesn't, and so on. And we've kind of, we've taken that viewpoint almost without thinking about it. We've taken it up. But Nietzsche, Spengler, a lot of other historians and social scientists since then, have really taken a step back here and said, is this really the right way to evaluate a society just through this one very narrow viewpoint of technology and science? And this is a good counterpoint for us because we are so, our culture is so embedded in, or science and technology is so embedded into our culture, we don't even think about it. It's like fish in the water. We swim in it all day long. And so it's very interesting for somebody like Nietzsche to take us by the hand and say, you know what, maybe look at it again and look at it from a different standpoint. Now, connected with this introductory idea is his next thesis, which is even more astounding in some ways, which is this. And I'm just retelling you what he wrote. And he wrote that the proper metaphysical goal of man's existence is art. The proper metaphysical goal of our existence is art. Now that is quite a statement. I wish I knew how to say it in German, but if anybody knows German, this is probably something good to memorize because it's so, it summarizes his thinking. And then he adds to it, he says, not morality, which is another, if you know Nietzsche and you know his distaste for morality, or at least Christianity as a dominant form of morality at that time, where he's going to go in his later writings with that. But he says that morality has essentially usurped our unmediated thirst for life. In other words, it has caused us to look at life as not worthy of existence apart from some sort of moral framework, and other things have done the same to life. So he has now expanded art to a larger sphere of life, but really they're all the same, because if art is in fact the proper sphere of man's activity, which he claims it is, then they are basically the same. And then in another place he says art is not a diversion from something else. It is what we're supposed to, what we're meant to do, what we're meant to create is art. And he takes it even a step further to say that, in fact, the aesthetic expression of the universe, the beauty of the world, is the only justification for God's existence and God's creative power. So, and I have a quote here. Okay, an altogether unmoral and thoughtless. This is interesting. Unmoral and thoughtless artist God, who desires to become conscious of his own joy and sovereign glory, and then ... through the creation, through the artistic medium of the world, of the experience that we have. So this is, again, I'm just presenting his thoughts, which I find so interesting, and I'm, it is just, it's a jumping off point, right? It's a departure point for us to really take it in and say, well, was he right? And if he was, to what degree, and what can we learn about this? Another connection I'd like to make, so I made one connection with Oswald Spengler. The other connection I'd like to make is to a work we read not too long ago by Carl Jung, which is 7 Sermons to the Dead. And if you remember that work, we met with this concept of God as the one who actually embodies both good and evil, because both are expressions of being. And I think that God is called Abraxas, versus Helios, who is the God of just the good, just the sun, right? Just the light, but not the darkness. But in Jung's and in Nietzsche's, and of course, Jung borrows a lot of Nietzsche's ideas or builds on them, the idea of life carries its own value. It carries its own reason for existence. It doesn't need to be justified by morality, it doesn't need to be justified by anything. It is already worthy of pursuit to its highest degree. And of course, you see these ideas of, you know, the Übermensch, you see the ideas of beyond good and evil, you see the ideas of, you know, his later works already sown in this framework so early in his writing. He's thinking not about anything, he's not thinking about morality, religion, but he's thinking about art. And in that, he's thinking about everything, because art to him is this key activity of man, and everything is centered around. And then if you take that viewpoint, then you start to understand that pessimism, if it produces art, is in fact a good thing. And optimism, if it doesn't, you know, if it leads you to not being productive and fulfilling your destiny, then it's a bad thing, no matter what else can be said about it. Go ahead, Shrikant.
So Phil, I mean, this is a profound point. So can you spend a little bit time on talking about what he thinks is art at its best? You know, he's clearly saying that that is the goal. So what is art?
Right. Okay. So that actually brings us to the next, you know, he obviously proceeds to develop that. So the next point is, like you said, what is art? Well, to jump into this, art is a merger between these two opposing forces in our lives, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. And art is, I mean, this is where I guess this is where the interpretation or my summary of it comes in, is art in a way is a sublimation of dealing with both of those. So Greeks in their history, in their life, they've taken the Dionysian, the Apollonian streaks, if you will, or streams, maybe be a more forceful word to use, and they've woven them into a single unity. And of course, Nietzsche also uses the metaphor of procreation, where you need two sexes, the male and the female, to produce anything. And art is also this procreative activity where you take two things that are both part of your life and you transform them into something that justifies life. Because life, according to Nietzsche, and you know, we all know this, is not just all beautiful and cheerful. At least it's not supposed to be, according to him, because if it is, then it's never going to produce art. Because why would you need art if everything is already great and wonderful and you never have experience of suffering? Suffering is almost a requirement in his mind, according to at least what I'm reading here, is a requirement, required ingredient to produce art. If you don't have suffering, if in your psyche, in your conscious, unconscious, you're never going to have the impulse to weave anything, because you have only one strand, the positive, and you need both. You need the order and the disorder, the chaos and the order to produce this work of art that's going to stand the test of time. And to him, the Greek tragedy was this unique expression where in a culture they were able to weave the suffering and the chaos and the, you know, the order of their mythology into this single beautiful whole that produced the tragedy.
Right. So folks would love to hear what, especially people who are familiar with Nietzsche, about this particular view of art. You know, what is art and what is the deepest meaning of it? We'll start with Steve. Steve, go ahead.
So I'm looking at my notes, and the very beginning, Nietzsche, he's got his note that he wrote in 1886. And he says that, he talks about the fundamental psychological experiences, says that Apollonian stands for the state of rapt repose in the presence of a visionary world, in the presence of the world of beautiful appearance designed as a deliverance from becoming. The word Dionysus, on the other hand, stands for strenuous becoming, grown self-conscious in the form of the rampant voluptuousness of the creator, who is also perfectly conscious of the violent anger of the destroyer. So I wrote in my notes that it is as if Nietzsche is describing the Apollonian as akin to enlightenment, which is this state in which existence in and of itself is complete and full, and also had it akin to consciousness. With, I mean, later, I think Nietzsche says this straight out, that Apollo is consciousness and Dionysus is unconsciousness. So how he's establishing this kind of Greek tile is pretty obvious, where Apollo is kind of the yang energy and Dionysus the yin, and Apollo is masculine, Dionysus is feminine. And for the sake of perennial philosophy, which is kind of a consistent intellectual interest of mine, the extent to which we can trace ideas through multiple religions, I'd liken Dionysus to Samsara. So I kind of want to know what you guys thought about that. I was like, maybe caught between Kali and Brahma. I wasn't really sure which Hindu gods would be the most representative of the voluptuousness of the creator and the violent anger of the destroyer. And last but not least, I know would be you also explored John and your other meetups. And I think it's Paul though, but he's recapitulating the Old Testament. I think it's twice in the Bible that says that man's head is the image and glory of God, and woman's head is the image and glory of man. So all of these seem to be a thread that you can trace through the Apollonian energy versus the Dionysian energy. So I want to know you guys' thought on that.
Sure. Fantastic observations, Steve. So I will quickly list 2 or 3 of these. I want to talk about order and chaos. I want to talk about and what Jordan Peterson has to say about it. I want to talk about Abraxas, and I want to talk about Shiva Shakti in the Indian tradition. And of course, the Tao and yin and yang. So this theme, now I'm going away from Nietzsche because I don't know exactly how he thinks about it, but I know these traditions a little bit better. So for example, Jordan Peterson is brilliant at this. He's saying there is order and chaos, and meaning is at the border of order and chaos. You have 1 foot in the order and 1 foot in the chaos. Otherwise, you have nothing. If you're completely in the chaos, you're completely lost. If you're completely in order, you're completely sterile and you're lost as well. So you need both of these. And that's where the action is. That's where the growth is. That's where the next version is going to come from. And the Abraxas idea is exactly the same thing. It is the circle. You're circling continuously. You're continuously getting things from the chaos, and you're continuously organizing them. And that's what is being alive means. So it is like you're ordering everything. It's kind of like, to me, like in the Indian tradition, it's like breathing in and breathing out. You're taking in stuff from outside, which is new to you, and then you're speaking out. So it's like you're kind of breathing in and breathing out. Louis Sullivan puts it very beautifully. Life began to break in upon him, and a continuous breaking in from the outside and breaking out from the inside was to shape his destiny. So both these movements are critical for growth. I did a whole presentation on Shiva Shakti, which is it's a profound way of integration of basically spirit and matter, of the ruling principle of the universe, which is Shiva, and the expression, the entire fecundity of expression of it, which is Shakti. And it is represented as one being. In both, it's one. So there is oneness in that. So this is called the Kashmiri Shaivism. So that is another form of it. So these are some of the things. Let's go to Phil. Phil, go ahead.
Okay, so let's dig a little bit deeper into the Apollonian versus Dionysian, how, the expression of it. I'm actually, again, I am mostly retelling what Nietzsche has written. Doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with his examples or his viewpoints, etc. But it's interesting to me that he uses dreams as an example of the Apollonian realm, which again, it was surprising to me because dreams are typically associated with the unconscious, with something we cannot control, therefore more chaotic. But in his mind, dreams are forms. They're forms of the real. So in that sense, they are much more idealistic. They're much more Apollonian. But the contrast that he draws to that is the state of drunkenness, which of course we know Dionysus is the god of wine and drinking and is associated with partying and reveling and so on. But it's interesting that he makes this distinction between dreams, the state of dreaming, and the state of drunkenness. And in his mind, dreaming is where you get your epic writing from. And drunkenness is where you get your lyric writing from and music. And if you remember, the name of the work is Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music. And he spends a little bit of time talking about the dithyramb, which was a type of hymn that was sung to specifically in Dionysian processions. And in fact, we can trace the very beginning of tragedies, at least according to Aristotle, to that specific expression of Greek life. It was a quasi-religious, quasi-civil, civic celebration, public celebration, right? And it grew into a chorus. A chorus, of course, was the major part of early Greek tragedies, and then it kind of recedes. And Nietzsche actually traces the recession of the chorus with what he considers a decline in artistic power of the tragedies. So we have a lot here. We have the connection with dreams and drunkenness, connection with music, connection with this origin of tragedy as the merging of two movements, right? The movement to the epic, which is of course epitomized by Homer, and the movement to the lyric, which Nietzsche is associating with Archilochus, who was the developer of the lyric rhythm. So yeah, I'll stop here to see if there's any thoughts.
Let's go with Maritza, followed by Srera. Maritza.
I just wanted to briefly pick up on the pointing out of Nietzsche using dreams for Apollonian, and I just wanted to clarify. So in chapter 4 is where, if you're looking for book references, you'll find it in chapter 4 in the Birth of Tragedy. He goes into a detailed explanation of why dream, and he specifically states that that Apollo is as the ethical deity, he demands due proportion of his disciples, and that he also demands through this discipline self-knowledge. And the idea of the dream is that it's not just dream as the modern definition of dream, it's dream contemplation. So, when we hear dream compared to Apollonian, let's just remember that he's not talking about, oh, I just had a crazy mythical dream. He's talking about a dream, and he says specifically, to be at all able to dream with this inner joy and contemplation, we must have completely forgotten the day and its terrible obtrusiveness, so that we may, under the direction of the dream reading Apollo, interpret all these phenomena to ourselves somewhat. And I think that that's why that's why the dream falls into that category, as opposed to the Dionysian, because, you said drunkenness. Drunkenness is the opposite of contemplation. You are acting on instinct. And if you were to do, and I have my notes, I made a little tree of all the key words and phrases that throughout the text Nietzsche uses for Apollonian and for Dionysian, and he puts instinct on the side of Dionysian, and that's obvious. And so the reason he puts that there is drunkenness. You're not thinking and contemplating, you are just reacting. So that would be, to me, if you view it in that way, it makes perfect sense why then he would say this dream state would fall under Apollonian. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. And welcome, Doug. I'm glad that you could make it, because would love to hear your thoughts about tragedy once we come to it. Sarah, you're next.
Yeah, I just wanted to just raise an issue regarding how pessimism, this idea of creating art, how you incorporated like the Hindu belief of it's breathing in, breathing out. I just want to point out how these themes are paramount in existentialism, because one of the foundational principles of existentialism is anguish. And because even when you're not choosing, you're choosing. And Nietzsche is an avid existentialist. So it's so interesting to read this book because it's almost poetic. He's taking these major existentialist themes and writing them in such a poetic way, art, creation. And in essence, it's really every single day, like you pointed out to the Hindu belief, it's we're creating ourselves through breathing in, breathing out. It's a natural thing, but each thing is a choice. And I would relate the pessimism into anguish as well, because you can't escape the choices. And once you choose, then existentialism takes it further, and then you're sitting in your consequences. And then you get to a point, and I see drunkenness to the point that you are so you get so filled with this angst because each choice is going to be creating your life and the world and your reality and your life, that you turn in, for me, having such I would say a pretty advanced like mind and intellectual mind at my point, after having studied, gone to law school, etc. That's a total side point. Point being is now I'm so conscious that every single thing is a choice, even when I'm choosing not to choose it. And it's angry, and I get drunk. I'm just like, how did these choices, it's constant, you can't escape your choices. And I just wanted to relate that to the major themes of existentialism, because I just want to have everyone, if you could just remember, as you do read Nietzsche, he is an avid existentialist. He is one of the founding thinkers among those that have started the philosophy of existentialism. So
thank you.
Just wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you, sir. All right, let's continue. Phil.
Okay. So let's take another quick snapshot at Homer. So Homer is obviously the main protagonist of the epic line, the Apollonian tradition, as Nietzsche sees it. Why? Why is he that? And the primary reason is that he creates this, or maybe not creates it, but he relates to us the idea of this Olympic pantheon, the pantheon of Olympic gods. Now, what's interesting about that, just like with dreams, to me, it's a new interpretation of things that I already knew about, in that we typically think of gods as being sort of larger than life representations of ourselves. At least that was my interpretation of Greek gods when I was younger. And this is what I've heard all my life, is essentially Greeks, they imagined these beings that were sort of like them, but multiplied by 100. So now Nietzsche takes a completely different view of them. He says, no, they are not, in fact, reflections of their lives, because who lived like that? Nobody lived like the Greek gods. Who is immortal? Who is forever young? Who is unlimited? Who is always beautiful and drinking ambrosia and nectar and so on? Nobody lives like that. So it's not actually a reflection at all. But if it's not a reflection, then what is it? Well, it's this sublimation of unfulfilled desires and unfulfilled fantasy, if you will, but sublimated in a way that is completely orderly and completely predetermined and has this absolute hierarchy, right? So it's, in one sense, it's completely unhinged, where they can do whatever they want, but at the same time, it's very much regulated because everybody has this hierarchy, and Zeus is at the top and everybody is sort of like below him. So it's a picture of this complete order, and at the same time, a picture of a complete enjoyment of life to the fullest. And this is the Apollonian take on life. This is the Apollonian view of reality as this fullest expression, right? There's nothing mitigated here, right? It's completely unmitigated, completely untarnished by anything, unlimited by any kind of morality, for sure. It's just enjoyment of the moment, right? That's what's deified in Greek art, in sculpture, in what, you know, in epic poems, in Homer, right? Specifically, it's this joy of living, and we can absolutely call it existentialism because it's assertion of life. You, at every point, you assert that you are, and there is nobody's going to limit you in any way. And it's beautiful in its own right, but it's not enough to produce the kind of art that Nietzsche is after, and that requires the other side of it. And the other side of it is the art that is based on, like Maritza said, based on instinct, based on feeling, without this elaborate contemplation, meditation that produces this orderly hierarchy. And that's the Dionysian aspect of it. And of course, it's represented by music, because everything in music is based on feeling, on instinct, the rhythm, the melody, the even the dancing itself, right, which was part of the music, right? It wasn't just people playing on an instrument. It was a participatory experience. The other thing that he points out is the fact that again, it's the suffering of life on one side and the need to well, let's put it this way: the suffering of life on one side, the understanding that it can be different. And this is where the Greek I guess delicacy of thinking and intellectual prowess comes in, where they really understood that life can be different, the experience can be different, but yet it's not there, it's not actualized. And this creates a huge conflict, creates a huge problem intellectually, emotionally, every other way. And so they express that conflict in art. They express that, maybe not consciously. Nobody, I don't think anybody sat down and said, well, let's invent a God. But the psychology, of these type of opposing forces of reality versus the need to experience life to its fullest and realizing what it can be, maybe subconsciously again, is what created this grand explosion, if you will, into mythological realm. And the result of it is the epic poetry of Homer and other epic writers. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful. So would love any comments. And Phil, I was wondering whether, I was wondering about one thing. The background for everything that Nietzsche is saying is actually knowing what the Greek tragedy is. What kind of a thing. So I was thinking whether it would be appropriate to talk a little bit about what Greek tragedy is fairly early. What do you think?
Well, I don't really have a definition of it.
No, not you. I'm not asking you.
Yeah,
people
sure,
here
yeah.
would be able to.
Sure.
Sure. So let's do that. Folks, I want to say just a couple of things here. Firstly, I want to pitch the meetup that we are doing this Sunday with Phil at 5 o'clock. We're going to be 5 p.m. Eastern time, and it's going to be Antigone by Sophocles. That's by far my favorite Greek tragedy. And you really need to experience the Greek tragedy in order to see what it is, because it's like the foundation of what Nietzsche is talking about is that there is something good about this thing, this Greek tragedy. So
Which play are you doing on Sunday? I'm sorry.
Antigone.
Oh,
No, we're not going to play the whole thing. Doug,
no,
I know
right,
that's
right.
what you normally do, but Doug, can I request you to talk a little bit about Greek tragedy and how would you relate it to a modern audience? What is it, and what do you like about it?
Well, I do talk a lot about it in the Bucky lecture I did, or
Mhm.
synergetic dramaturgy, and in much more detail. I'll try to summarize it in terms of what I picked up from this, which I was reading when we were adapting the Oedipus trilogy into TV talk show formats, where Oedipus was like a Clintonian town meeting gone wrong, turned into Jerry Springer,
Mhm.
and then Antigone was sort of court TV with Creon's hanging jury being like the McLaughlin group, commentating, but really just doing whatever Creon wants them to do. And I'm going in, and the Colonus, which is the longest of all the Greek tragedies, was the shortest. Ours was about 18 minutes. It was like a deathbed interview with Ismene, who was living at the Chateau Marmont in Hollywood, and all of her family had been dead for decades. And she's doing a Barbara Walters-like deathbed interview as to how Oedipus really died. And they even bring up Kennedy, Jimmy Hoffa, how did Oedipus really die? And she talks about the phenomenal moment when he walks through a crack in the mountain and all the meaning of that. But it's, what we get from Nietzsche, I think, is probably the first modern thinker to really understand and state how much Greek tragedy lives in two worlds, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, and that there's nothing, that it's a really alive thing of the spirit. And I think that's where the music reference comes from, and not, this thing, this masterpiece that is sort of studied like a monument or a statue. And around that time, I think anthropologists or archaeologists realized that the beautiful white gleaming statues were painted in very vibrant colors. So I think if you want to really understand the chaos of Greece, you don't really, the healthy chaos, when I say that, the sort of fertile chaos of it. If you read not just Thucydides on the Peloponnesian War, which is a real rational explanation, but if you read Herodotus, where he mixes history, myth, legend, and all kinds of things, and then read Homer, then you start to get a picture. And I think Nietzsche understood how whacked out it was, that you have Apollo saying, this is how we live, this is the truth. And they have Dionysus, who is really the god of dismemberment, of being torn apart, who's sort of an extension of Osiris, and even connections later to the myths around Christianity, the god who is destroyed and comes back. And so it's the god that says it's okay for things to fall apart. And that's why Oedipus is a hero. He destroys himself to discover who the murderer is, and that cures the plague that's haunting the land. And most people sort of get distracted by, oh, he slept with his mother, which he didn't really. He did everything he could to avoid sleeping with his mother, which is why he ended up killing his father through the fates. And it's more the parents sort of have betrayed the child and left him on a mountaintop, and they're punished by the child they left on the mountaintop. But it's their fear of the oracles that gets them destroyed. And Oedipus is the sort of figure who really cures the land, and who is out to cure the plague. And to do that, he has to find who spilled the blood of the previous king, and he pursues it relentlessly. Even his mother figures it out and says, don't go there, and he goes there. And he destroys himself in the process of it, and he heals the land. So it's a very different kind of leadership than Creon, who is willing to destroy everybody to preserve his own power. So this balance of the Apollonian structure with and so you see this in Indian literature, the creator, the sustainer, the destroyer, the creator, the sustainer, the destroyer. And so there are a lot of things in the Gita that make more sense of Greek tragedy than all the Western scholars who try to put it up on a pedestal, you know. And I think Nietzsche put him down on the ground and up on the heights and in the rivers, and he really, returned it to a form of poetry. So that's my
Wonderful.
And that Apollo and Dionysus, they were both worshipped for alternating 6 months periods, and at Delphi, at the Oracle at Delphi. I mean, we associate that with I think Apollo, but during the winter months they handed it over to Dionysus. So Greek culture is definitely the contrasts that come out in a lot of different things we've been studying, the fusion of total conflict, not conflict even, just disparity, difference, male, female, high, low. And I think he gets into some male and female things, and he's not talking about sexual identity, he's talking about certain character things where people can come up with an idea and disseminate an idea in others, but some other thinker is going to nurture that idea and carry it to fruition. And Nietzsche kind of understood that. I think he even refers to that in The Birth of Tragedy. But I'm working from memory, so I may have a lot of this wrong.
Well, Doug, thank you so much, because you added the kind of the richness of you at least alluded to the depth and the richness which is out there that you need to kind of take in order to fully appreciate what Nietzsche is saying. So I thought that was really well done.
Well, and Dionysus is the god of theater. So if you take that seriously when you're studying theater in school in the Greeks, it's why theater people drink a lot of wine. It's to serve their god, It's
a requirement. Awesome.
Wonderful. And
the god often destroys them for all that wine they drink, so it's a very tricky commitment.
Wonderful. Thank you, Doug. Next up is Joe.
So I just have a quick question, I guess, is that, I guess Greek tragedies are used to kind of confront an existential crisis, so to speak. I mean, that's the way I'm looking at this. If you're looking at it from the way it was just described here, and it's more of a question than a statement. So I'm just putting that out there. That's the way I'm taking this in. Because it is true, you really do need to know the Greek tragedies in order to really understand what's going on here. So,
yeah, it's absolutely, it seems to be the case. In fact, I think that's why art is associated with catharsis, right? The cleansing. If you watch it, you watch the cleansing of you are cleansed by watching or participating in a way with what's happening. Of course, Apollo is the god of healing. And that's another connection that you can draw from that, is in the process of this Dionysian / Apollonian conflict, you get the healing that is inherent in this sort of tug of war between the two. I do want to make one comment about, Shrikant asked me to talk about the origin or what tragedies are, but in order to understand something, you have to look at the origin, right? I mean, that's kind of a given. So the word tragedy, tragodia, comes from the Greek word for goat song, right? And again, that harkens back to how it started. It started out as a religious cult of Dionysus, where people would dress up and they would have laurels around their necks, and they would wear skins and play avalos, which is this type of pipe. And it would be a celebration, a musical celebration. At some point, probably the chorus emerged, so it became a singing and musical celebration. The dithyrambus, right? That's the idea of the dithyramb, which is a hymn to Dionysus, as opposed to a paean, which is a lyric hymn, which is the Apollonian version of the same thing. In fact, what's another interesting tidbit is you can see the dichotomy or the struggle between the two emblematized in the story of Marsyas versus Apollo. Marsyas, of course, if you remember, is the unlucky satyr who decided to challenge Apollo to a contest. He thought he was better at music. But what's interesting to me in this story, and I didn't remember this until I looked it up, is Marsyas uses avlos. He uses that reed pipe as his instrument. What does Apollo use? He uses a lyre. So the two instruments themselves are very much apropos of the dichotomy. They represent a more instinctive, more emotional, almost like jazz-like playing versus a lyre, which is very precise. It's much more, it's a string instrument versus a windpipe instrument. A wind, of course, is more instinctual. It's more you're breathing out. You're expressing yourself. It's more material, if you will. Whereas a lyre is more intellectual. It's more ordered. It's more premeditated. It's more structured. So in that case, Apollo wins, and Marsyas is skinned alive, and it's terrible. But it shows this sort of dichotomy and struggle. The other interesting story of the struggle is, we talked about the Olympian gods and how everything is super ordered and static in a way, but of course it's not. And Prometheus, the story of Prometheus, is the outlier story in this scheme, where you have a god challenging another god. Of course, Prometheus is the Titan who represents the forces of chaos, the forces of prime evil, instinctual, chaotic, everything that the Olympian gods are set against, and are in fact trying to dominate. So it's very interesting how these stories, they express this dichotomy, the struggle, this dynamism, and tragedy in a way is born out of this continual challenge, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's this whole movement is predicated on this conflict.
Thank you. All right, next up is Paul. Paul, what do you have to say about this?
Good evening. Love it. First, that's what I have to say is love it all. Secondly, related to Shrikant, your point earlier about cultures and pessimism and optimism, and it's kind of a thesis I want to present as a question, but it feels like Nietzsche was saying, okay, when a culture that stresses scientific achievement as the value is in decline. I got that right? Is that correct? Okay, and secondly, though, I'm asking if, and I kind of feel this way, that a culture that puts suffering in the wrong place in its worldview is in trouble. And you can look at Western psychology, because Jung never really caught on, honestly, like positive psychology caught on. And a lot of modern culture tries to just delete suffering, delete, or mask suffering. And would Nietzsche agree that that's also a sign of an illness? Because suffering is cathartic. This is like beautiful, it's radical. And am I getting this right? And do you share my opinion? Thanks. Medications also. I'm very worried about masking suffering with medications. I mean, psych meds. It's a whole other subject, but any thoughts? Thank you.
Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I think you're dead. I mean, I absolutely agree with everything you said, Paul, especially the medication part. I mean, I don't think Dostoevsky or Tolstoy would have written anything like what they have if they had Prozac and, and, a shrink available to them. It's really out of that crucible of suffering, and nobody looks for it necessarily unless it's part of your character, right? Character is fate. In case of Dostoevsky, you can say probably he suffered as much because of what an impassioned person he was, and he was a gambler, a player, and that kind of predetermined the suffering that he had. But again, if he never had it, I doubt we would have had these masterpieces today. So yeah, I absolutely agree that by taking away the suffering, and what is it about suffering, I guess, is why is it such a vital force? Because it's part of this Abraxas God that is both good and evil. And if you take the if you have a piano and it can cover however many octaves it covers, and you just dissect it to just be this much, that's what medication does. And, we know that it limits the ups and the downs to just a very short spectrum. And in that spectrum, you can produce very little. But with great spectrum, you can produce great works. And as we read some of these works of art, the Greeks and the more modern, I think you can feel that the person who's writing, he wrote it from experience versus just, academically. I mean, and that's, I think, this is a good segue to talk about Euripides, because Euripides in Nietzsche's mind. Sorry, I'll stop here.
Okay, so I want to say one thing. I love Nietzsche because he is a very honest commentator on his time. He actually points out what's wrong in the most uncompromising way. I think there are people who have integrated things better than he has, of saying, how do these actually work together? Like many things in the Indian tradition are much more kind of naturally integrated, like the Chinese tradition of the Tao integrating the yin and yang. It's very, very deep. Even somebody like Jung captures it beautifully, like, in the filth it would be found. Or Christianity, that you have to die in order to be born again. You have to be willing to let parts of you die in order to be resurrected and to have new life. So these are all kind of different ways of putting the same thing, which are really beautifully integrated in their own way. So there are many, many, many ways of thinking about these same issues. But Paul, thank you so much, because like if you say that I'm never going to look at anything negative, that means you're never going to look at anything other than that is already in your head, whatever you're familiar with, whatever it is, whatever ideas you hold, whatever emotions you hold. And the world doesn't go away. The dragon doesn't go away. It keeps becoming bigger and bigger. And you build bigger and bigger walls, using Prozac and other things. So very well put. Thank you. Sorry about the interruption, Phil. Please go on.
Right. So this is a good segue to talk about Euripides, because this is the next movement in the development of Greek tragedy, which is to say that it becomes more of a trade and more of an intellectual process, as opposed to just sort of impulsive creation process, right? And Euripides, early on, you can tell there's a difference in his early plays versus his later plays. Part of it is the declining influence or place of the chorus. As we mentioned, the chorus was the original impetus for the play's development anyway, and then it recedes more and more into the background, becomes less and less prevalent, and eventually it becomes almost like an ornament, not an integral part of the play. And what does chorus represent in general? Well, the chorus is this raw feeling of what's happening. It's the reaction to what's happening. It's this chaotic fear or sympathy or any other emotion that we experience when we're faced with things that we cannot fully understand or explain. And it provides this antithesis to the plot and to the dialogue, which is somewhat controlled and premeditated. Now, Euripides makes more of an effort to make everything kind of structured and thought out. And the effect of that, according to Nietzsche, is that he loses some of that original potency of the older plays, the older tragedies. So again, this is his viewpoint on it. I'm not necessarily saying I agree with it or disagree, but that's his take on the natural development of this. And what happens next is what he calls the emergence of the Socratic demon as a spectator. And the Socratic demon is this idea that you can only really appreciate something if you fully understand it, or to the degree that you understand it. So in other words, it's not, you can't just watch a waterfall without understanding how it all works. You can't, I mean, it's kind of a ludicrous idea, but when you read Socrates, that's what he's getting at, because Socrates, what was his idea? He emerged in the scene, and his thing was, his claim was, people say things as if they know what they're talking about, but they actually don't. And if you start questioning them on anything, you realize how ignorant they are. And his method, the Socratic method, is to question everything until you get to the bottom of, supposedly, of whatever it is you're trying to figure out. So justice, beauty, love, people talk as if they know what it is, but they don't, and therefore let's dissect it, let's cut it all up into little pieces, and then try to put it back together into a cohesive whole. And that has been essentially the direction of Western thought ever since, if you will, Socratic in some ways. We've tried to apprehend the world, not with our hearts, but with our minds. And to a degree, Nietzsche would say that we've lost a lot of that original vibrancy that was there. And that's why when we read Homer and we're reminded of that vibrancy and reminded of that spirit, it touches us, because it rings something, it reawakens something very deep inside of us that we feel an echo that we perhaps have not heard before for a long time. So that's pretty much where I want to end, unless, again, you guys have other thoughts.
Sure. There are a few things. So firstly, this reminds me of Barfield and his observation that we have, in art, we have access to this different sensibility. The art, the great art, actually brings that alive in our heads, and it enables us to experience that. What is it like being a Greek in some form? So it produces that, that experience of consciousness expanding. So wonderful. Let's go with Maritza, followed by Doug. Maritza.
Hi, I wanted to expand a little bit on this concept of art and Socrates' view in it, because there's a specific, and for those who wanted to look at direct passages in the book, let me point you to chapter 14. Take a look at it. Nietzsche directly talks about Socrates and the idea of where he is despairing at because he's feeling a gap or a void. And there's this great quote that I wrote here in my notes, and he says, perhaps, and this is Socrates in prison, he keeps, and this is as per Nietzsche, he's having the same dream apparition that keeps telling him, Socrates, practice music. And so it's written by Nietzsche that Socrates says to himself, perhaps what is not intelligible to me is not therefore unreasonable. Perhaps there is a realm of wisdom from which the logician is banished. Perhaps art is even a necessary correlative of and supplement to science. That's one translation. And I have more than one copy of the book, and I have a slightly different copy that says, perhaps there is a kingdom of wisdom which is forbidden to the logician. Perhaps art is even a necessary correlative and supplement to scientific understanding. And I think it's a fascinating line to me, because it portends the idea of how Nietzsche is explaining to us that, art, it's like he says that this thinking process many people will have, and it's gonna, he even says, like in the next chapter, he says it's like an ever increasing shadow, and he's saying it necessitates the regeneration of art. And he says it's of art already with metaphysical, and he's saying the broadest sense. So he's trying to make sure that we're clear that he's speaking in philosophical realm as opposed to the literal. And that's one thing that, you know, many existentialists do. They use tragedy. Tragedy is one of their main themes, but they're taking it out of the realm of the literal and more into the philosophical. And so I just, to me, that's a really strong point that he's using to show on the art. Also in that, much earlier in the book, he makes a point of saying that it's very important for us to ensure that we separate the idea of being from the idea of appearance. And if I can just remind you, if we're making our column for what lies on Nietzsche's Apollonian side and Nietzsche's Dionysian side, the appearance is Apollonian and being is Dionysian, feeling and such. So as he looks at it, he says that. So I struggle a little bit with that statement. It's one that I go back to a lot because initially I was thinking I was seeing contradictions. But as I've gotten to better understand Nietzsche's works, because let's remember, this is his very first work, as Phil pointed out to us. He clarifies on his ideas as he goes forth. And I believe what he's doing there is he's identifying that ultimately he finds the primacy here of what he's saying to lie in the approach of the Dionysian approach to music, to art, and because he holds as primary being. So, and again, that's my extrapolation. So separate idea of being from idea of appearance. That's Nietzsche's statement. My extrapolation, and I would love to hear somebody contradict me or tell me their thoughts. I think that what he's getting at is he's trying to tell us that he's viewing the being as primary. And it's a fascinating view. And he also has in Will, I think it's in Will to Power, there's this, I mean, everybody, maybe not everybody, sorry, but many will be familiar with the quotes that he makes on genius, right? He says, genius resides in instinct. And then he goes on, he says, one acts perfectly when one acts instinctively. So remember again, instinct is on the side of Dionysian, and we've said that art is on the side of Dionysian for Nietzsche's perspective. To me, that is just, I see the threads weaving of the stronger views that he's going to put forth in his future books, which is just, it's kind of just lovely to see it in its infancy, as it were. But if we look at this from the perspective of art, it leads us to believe that he's making some corollary here with his visions and thinking of genius and his visions and thinking of art. That's my extrapolation. It's not something I saw written anywhere, but I just wanted to put that out there. And maybe in case some of you are more familiar with some of his other works, as opposed to this one, maybe that'll help. I don't know, just my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Marisa. That was wonderful. Next up is going to be Doug. Doug, go ahead.
I would recommend maybe bringing Kirby Erner into this at some point, because when I was sort of, as a junior in college, shifting from studying political geography to declaring theater as my major, that year I also read a lot of Nietzsche. I read the Portable Nietzsche, I think, from cover to cover. And that's edited and translated by Walter Kaufman, who was Kirby's teacher at Princeton. And he wrote another book on Nietzsche, and it might be interesting.
Oh, really?
to have.
Kirby seems to be a very surprising person. He always astonishes.
Yeah, he's also a Quaker, and so he has this division between, I think in this country we like to create dichotomies, either or choices. In the news, you can see it doing that all the time. But really, to reach the opposites, you don't need the Prozac to give you a narrow brand. You need a big balancing pole like a tightrope walker, so you can reach to the extremes and integrate them. And that's a thing that when we were working up this idea to base a production on TV talk shows and realize the geometric structure was the same, we you know, we did a lot of weighing in on it. And the thing about, well, my mind's going in about 8 different directions, but there is a book by Karl Jaspers, which is about Socrates, Buddha, Confucius, and Jesus. And his view of Socrates is that he takes people to the edge of their rational mind, to where their minds are literally blown and they can't come to a simplistic explanation. And he writes about this, Karl Jaspers, as almost as a Zen breakthrough. And in another book edited by Ken Arendt, he talks about some of the early Greek philosophers, but also Lao Tzu. And so that idea of how you take the chaos, and by Euripides, a lot of people, the psychology gets much more melodramatic and tragic and wild, and the chorus no longer debates the issue or participates in the debates like the city of Athens. What do we have at stake in this story? And the chorus argues, and what's really going on? What do you think's happening? Do they have a plan? But by Euripides, the chorus is, and I think I'd like to track that, what Philip says, and where that happens, that as he keeps writing, where does the change happen? But the chorus begins to represent the forces of nature. You know, they're not talking about what's happening, how are we going to solve this, what's going to do it. They're talking about, you know, trees crashing into rivers, going downstream, and fires and thunder and all those sort of elements that Mary Shelley pulls into Frankenstein. It's really a representation of the forces of nature as a metaphor for the internal psychology. And so Euripides is much more of an insane writer, and his production, like, which we might get into too, of the Bacchae, which there was a very famous production, I'll put it in the chat, in the 60s. So the 60s, I remember what I was going to say. When we thought about doing this production, the Greeks always feel far away. You know, Shakespeare's closer to us. But in fact, the Greeks are closer to us than Shakespeare because they're so crazy. You know, what they're dealing with is so crazy. And once you make that flip, then there's nothing strange about the Greeks at all. They're like what America is, and the conflicts. Although I think we've gone more under Roman influence in recent years. I mean, which England is definitely associated with Rome and hates the Greeks. The US, I think, started on the Greek ideal and almost an anti-Roman reaction, anti-British Empire reaction. And then in a way have become more Roman. In the way that George Bernard Shaw said that Rome was not Christianized, Christianity was Romanized. You know, the things, it's very complex the way these things happen through history. And I think Nietzsche understands that. And Walter Kaufmann, I began to read a lot of his other philosophical books, religion and philosophy. And he talks a lot about poetry, where he says the Jewish prophets are poetic, the Greek tragedies are poetic, some of the Zen Mahayana writers are poetic. And he really talks about religion and poetry as being the same thing. And so that's maybe worth tossing into the mix here. But
Wow.
They're not so strange. The Greeks are very, once you flip a switch, you realize, oh, this is happening all around us, you know.
So Doug, this is fantastic. So I've two observations in 2 different directions here. The first one is from the work of the Center for the Study of Digital Life. They've done several meetups with us. And they point out that when you look at these times that we are studying, the Tao Te Ching, Bhagavad Gita, Gospel of John, those are, you know, what they call the scribal age. And then there is the printing press that comes, and the way in which people engage with ideas and how their life transforms in modern times starts from there. And this division, so if you go back to Bhagavad Gita is all integrated. So the Jnana Yoga and Bhakti Yoga and Dhyana Yoga and Karma Yoga, you just flow between them. Similarly, you go to Tao Te Ching, yin and yang is basically both Tao. So Tao is like the three-part division there. Tao as being the principle that is governing this flow between yin and yang. Similarly, when you look at the Gospel of John, there is this unity to spirit and matter. It's like 100% man, 100% God. It is spirit being transformed into matter, kind of God on earth. It's all of those integrations are there throughout. So they are in works of Aristotle. When you look at De Anima, you see the same kind of integration, and that's what you see in the Greek thing that we are looking at here. Now, when you go to modern times, post Descartes, what happens is that you get this idea of these things called books. Okay, millions of them, and people think that they can read and just try to deduce from there without actually having the ability to induce themselves. In scribal time, all ideas, even they were written down. Writing was a crucial part of scribal, but there was always this oral envelope and a community around the books. So whether it is the peripatetic school of Aristotle, whether it is the Gurukuls in India, or Lao Tzu talking to his students, there is this dialogue where there is the fullest expression of character, emotions, reason, actions, all forming the foundation in which the ideas are moving. With printing press, that connection gets broken. And in some ways, Nietzsche is reacting to that world, that consequences. So in some ways, kind of us going back to these core scribal works in the axial age is a much better antidote than what Nietzsche is saying. Nietzsche is the lion, in his the Zarathustra metaphors, he's not the camel. He is complaining about the camels, the stupidity of the camels. He is mostly lion with a little bit of child in him, but mostly he's lion. He's saying no. It's a very loud no to what is around him. So that is one observation about where it fits in. The other observation that you had, which was very beautiful, is about America being more like Greece and as opposed to Rome, and increasing Rome. I mean, this is a observation. There is a writer called David Hackett Fisher. He has the deepest idea on this. He says that the traditions of Southern Europe and traditions of Northern Europe are different. The things that they hold in value are different. Even the ideas of freedom are different. So the Southern Europeans call it liberty, Northern Europeans call it freedom. And they are very different kinds of things. And in America, we ended up having both of them. So there is the Roman, there is the kind of very structured kind of being, and then there is this, freedom in the core of your being. So there is like structure that is structured, and there is the core freedom that is there deep inside each individual. And the dance between them is what this whole, universe is about. And different cultures focus on different aspects of it. The modern times has definitely gone the structure route and not enough attention on the spirit and the soul. And that is, so I think, Nietzsche is reacting to that as well. So thank you so much for all these observations. Go ahead, Doug.
I just had a quick thing, a note to what Maritza said about art and science. It took me years in a way to figure this out, but what Bucky's saying about design science, it's a marriage of art and science. I mean, the scientists never knew what to make of Bucky. The artists always claimed him as their own. They just said, he's ours. And all great artists study science, and Leonardo da Vinci, and pigments, and, optics, and all of the, artists never see this split between science and art, and that's where I think that took me a long time, just a few years ago, to figure that out. Oh, that's it. That's trying to heal the split between the brain and the mind and the body and all these different obligations we have to different things.
That's a great observation. That's what we know. That's the core thing about Bucky. He has that spiritual center, thanks to transcendental influence. He has that spiritual center,
Yeah.
and he has the science and the geometry. And his geometry is shaped by that kind of spirituality, of saying that everything is one. There is one universal law, and let me try to discover structures through which it can be manifested on Earth. So thank you. Folks, go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to make any general comments on Nietzsche, on this work. Would love to hear, step back and look at Nietzsche if you want, and say, okay, what is it that he offers? Just go ahead and type exclamation mark if you'd like to make any comments. Would love to hear from anybody. Phil, do you want to add any comments before other people continue?
Sure. Yeah, a couple of thoughts. So just thinking about some of the salient points that I'm personally taking away from this is what I mentioned earlier. The proper metaphysical occupation for man is art. The metaphysical activity, the proper metaphysical activity of man is art. That, to me, pretty much sums it up. Because once you have that viewpoint, then you start valuing things differently, and you can see how suffering can be an asset, how pessimism can be an asset. And in fact, Nietzsche, he's pretty explicit. He says it is out of the Greek pessimism towards life, and I don't think it's pessimism in the sense that they were doom and gloom. I think it's pessimism as in realism, as in being face to face with the awfulness, absurdity, chaos of life. It's that type of pessimism, not of I'm in depression type of pessimism, because that's not going to produce anything. But the pessimism of being face to face with the awfulness of it, it becomes a kind of potential energy in a way to produce something great. So that's probably the highlight. The other thing that I thought was interesting, or a good takeaway, is this idea that God's existence is justified by the world being an aesthetic phenomenon. And that's Nietzsche's theodicy, right? Theodicy is justification of God. So Nietzsche's theodicy is the world has life, the world has a certain beauty, and that justifies the suffering, that justifies the chaos, justifies everything else. So those are probably two thoughts. Third one, just a parting thought for those of you who were with us in Goethe's Faust. Goethe wrote in his notes prior to composing Faust, well, which was like a 30-year project, but anyway, he wrote that the formless matter is always preferred to a formed ideal. And in his mind, this chaos, the matter that can be actually transformed into anything, that always is higher. And so many of the themes that we saw in Faust are echoed in Nietzsche here, because Nietzsche also says that it's the chaos, the suffering, the unpredictability of life is what produces the beauty in art. If you take away that unpredictability, you're taking away the very elements that are going to produce something beautiful, because if everything is so predictable and so controlled and so regimented, well, the only thing you can probably produce is maybe some sort of dystopia like 1984, which is a great work, but you're not going to produce a Homeric epic poem or a Greek tragedy. So
thank you. Thank you, Phil. Folks would love to hear from you. Any thoughts? We're going to go with Paul, Rupali, followed by Joe. Paul.
Yeah, what you said, Doug, made me I kind of love it. And I love this radical thought. I'll tell you 3 examples, and then what I mean by the radical thought of a beautiful result of a scientific endeavor. One was, it's in the museum here in Cambridge at Harvard, the glass flowers. It's these Czech artists who made these amazing botanical, 100% accurate representations of these flowers for botanists. A second is the views latest from the Hubble telescope that are just astonishing artistic creations. The third is, I'm into this course learning about EEG and quantitative EEG, and the pictures or fMRI of the brain, the neurons from the amygdala to the brain imaged is just like jaw-dropping stunning. But what is the radical part is turn it all on its head. We spent those $8 zillion on the Hubble telescope, and we did all the brain imaging for art. We did it for art. Science is a side effect. I just love the thought. So I thought I'd put it out there.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Beautiful. Next up is Rupali, followed by Joe. Rupali.
Hi. I wanted to say that, Phil, you made a point about the formless matter being at the higher level than one with the form. And I wonder if, we talk about it in Shiva Shakti, whether that's the potential. And is that potential greater than the form or the manifestation of that potential? And we are always seeking that potential to be that potential. And the journey is towards that potential. So
yeah, it's absolutely that. It's absolutely that. And we saw that in Faust, if you go back to part 2 of Faust, you have the creation of Homunculus. Homunculus represents that potentiality. He's originally just a kind of idealized being in a retort, and he wants to get out there, and he's missing the potentiality of being alive. He is the ideal human being, but stuck in this idealized world, and he hates it. He realizes that's not life, that's not enough. He wants to get out, and he probably perishes. It's hard to interpret that, but he breaks his retort on the side of Galathea's chariot and becomes one with the ocean. The ocean, of course, being the primeval source of life and evolution. So, the potentiality being realized. So anyway, so this is probably like the perfect picture in Faust of this potential being higher than some sort of idealized form, which represents, again, if we're talking about Dionysian versus Apollonian, then of course the potential, the raw, that's all Dionysian. The ideal, the form, the Socratic kind of ideal, that's the Apollonian.
Rupali, if I may, I want to give one more example. I think the most beautiful capturing of this I've seen is the beginning of Tao Te Ching. See, Tao is all the potential, everything that is potential, including everything. So when you're open to the Tao, you're open to all possibilities. When you have names, you have 10,000 names, but those are dead things. Unless you go back to the Tao, you're holding on to something which is dead and which will, you're going to be separated from life. Go ahead, Rupali.
No, this conversation has been wonderful. I haven't read the work, so I'm looking forward to reading it. I've learned a lot today. And I thank you for the presentation and for everybody who's participated and shared their 2 cents, because I've learned a lot today. Thank you.
Thanks, Rupali. Next up is Joe.
Yeah, it's interesting to explore. I mean, there's another meetup that I actually attend that really goes into this, Apollonian and Dionysian differences, and sometimes they actually are really, shall I say, critical modernists of being hyper rational in certain ways. And I think it's important to explore as to why, in certain cases, that it's actually where rationality can not necessarily be an ideal. and specifically, and you have a limited perspective on the world many times, so that when you only use your Apollonian mind, which is what a lot of people gear themselves towards, that the decision-making process is limited by your biases and your experiences and the limited experiences that you have. And I think that that's something to really consider when you talk about, especially when you're talking to me, Get to Bucky and things along those lines, and you're talking about bringing things from the unseen to the seen, that you're actually thinking about, with a more artistic, say, creative mind, and from a more Dionysian perspective. That there's also the other aspect of this that I think is relevant to Nietzsche, and I would like maybe Phil and Doug or whomever's opinion on this, is that the Dionysian mind also allows you to essentially challenge authority, in the sense that you kind of can transcend social norms. And that's kind of what Nietzsche was doing. I mean, he's kind of rebelling in a way. And so I think that with you're using your Dionysian side, you're not necessarily limiting yourself to what you already experienced or what you already know. And then and so from that perspective, I think it also gives you an emotional depth. But there's just those thoughts that I've put on the table. It's just this distinction between Dionysian and Apollonian, just why the reasons we study it to begin with.
Thank you, Joe. Let's see. Does anybody else want to respond? What I will say is that I don't like this distinction, actually. I think the way in which Indian thought handles it, the Chinese thought handles it, Gospel of John handles it, is much, 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 much sophisticated than the terminology that Nietzsche has, because Nietzsche is trying to distinguish himself from the modern thing. But if you just forget about the modern thing and go back to this, it is far more easier to think about these things, because they are actually one, and we've kind of artificially separated them out, and then now we are saying, okay, which part, how do we put it back together? It's like Humpty Dumpty. It's broken, and it's much better to go back in time when Humpty Dumpty was on the wall than now. I mean, another way of putting it, another formulation I have is the map and territory. So territory is always unknown. You have a map for it. When you mistake the map for the territory, that's when you have the Apollonian, way, because you're saying, oh, this map is so clean and so beautiful and so nicely drawn, and I will just go by it and not see that the whole world is changing around you. And that's so if you have the approach of the OODA loop, for example, which captures all of this, of saying that you're continuously open to the changes and you're trying to orient yourself, and then you're going to decide what you need to do, and you're going to act, and you're going to continuously go through this loop. So this is like the Dionysian and Apollonian all integrated into a single loop, and you're trying to do that as fast as possible, as quickly as possible, so that you remain in sync with what is. So I think those are some of the ideas which are that I find useful. Anybody else wants to comment? Doug, go ahead.
Well, I have a quote that deals with that, and I think it starts with the idea of a poet, which Hugh Kenner said of Bucky. It's a poet's job he does to clarify the world. And Walter Kaufman thinks that all religion is a form of poetry, and that it gets in danger when it takes itself literally. And these poetic images and truths, and so, oh, that's how it really is. There is, and they get dogmatic about that. But here's the thing about Nietzsche, wherever you pick him up, and I picked up pages at random, there's something that just connects to me. I mean, it's just so concise. It is so rich. And here's a section that I think addresses issues that you've both been bringing up, or that Joe started with. The profound poet tells us that a man who is truly noble is incapable of sin. Though every law, every natural order, indeed the entire canon of ethics, perish by his actions, those very actions will create a circle of higher consequences, able to found a new world on the ruins of the old. This is the poet's message, insofar as he is at the same time a religious thinker. In his capacity as poet, he presents us in the beginning with a complicated legal knot, in the slow unraveling of which the judge brings about his own destruction. The typically Greek delight in this dialectical solution is so great that it imparts an element of triumphant serenity to the work, and thus removes the sting lurking in the ghastly premises of the plot. So that it is a way to get to the serenity, but not by minimizing the conflicts, by just pulling them out, and just that it's like it really is the creator, the sustainer, and the destroyer, which is that as it acts out in life, it's a dangerous game.
Or the cross and the resurrection. It's the same theme. You have to let things die. You have to be prepared to let things die for things to grow. Thank you. Next up is Maritza.
Doug's quote just made me think of in here in The Birth of Tragedy. Nietzsche states, he talks about melody, and he says it's a prime and universal fact. And he says melody gives birth to poetry from itself over and over again. And I just thought that was delightful. That's in chapter 6. I did want to make one comment on something you said, Shrikant. I think in some form, Nietzsche does agree with what you're saying. I think what he's doing is he's pointing out that separation to tell us that that's not where we want to be. If you look at chapter 9, in chapter 9, he's talking about, oh, awesome. Doug says the quote he read is also from chapter 9. So I may actually be repeating this, but he talks about this, he's saying, if you understand the core of the tale of Prometheus, then you'll get that ultimately, what Apollo is seeking, it can't be done without the mask wearing of Dionysian, proportions that's being done. So to conjecture it, so you need to have, he said it's the conjoint Dionysian and Apollonian nature that will get you there. And he says it might be thus expressed in this abstract formula. And it says, whatever exists is alike just and unjust, and equally justified in both. And that to me it's a great quote, again, to point to the Nietzsche that will become known for his strong stances in existentialism. That's like, it's saying the same thing, but in a slightly softer, more approachable note. And I just wanted to bring that up. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Marissa. I wanted to pick up on the point that Doug made about poetry, because like prophets actually were poets. That's the same word, same origin. That's what they were trying to do. And when you forget about poetry, it's like the heart of poetry or heart of language is metaphors. What you do as a poet is you're trying to use metaphors, using something that you're very familiar with in order to make you think about something that you're less familiar with. And you have these, as Barfield puts it very beautifully, when it works, you have this new felt change of consciousness. And that is exactly the aesthetic experience, the same as the aesthetic experience. It's the same as the religious experience when it is done about the world itself. You feel something fundamental about nature of existence, nature of you as a being, And that is what all this poetry does. And in some ways, you have to, when you get hubris and you get attached to those forms that you have formed, even though when they produced it for the first time, this amazing experience, and then you start deducing just from them and saying that, okay, now that I have gotten this, I don't need to go back to the Tao. I don't need to experience things again. I don't need to induce, because now I can only deduce. You're then stuck with these nice looking forms which are no longer alive. So just very, that is a great point, Doug. All right, anybody else? Phil.
Yeah, I just want to say a couple of things. So one, thank you, Doug, for reading that. That was a great passage there. I also caught my eye. The true hero can never sin. That's a loaded statement, and I think it can be easily misinterpreted. But we need to understand that it was said in the context, of course, of art. In art, the hero can never sin, and there's a certain joy and a certain glory in the experience of Oedipus, who goes, like you said, starts out at a high point, goes down to complete disintegration, just like Dionysus, and then reemerges from that in something like a triumph. And that experience has made me think of connecting this work and some of the things we talked about with Freud's also seminal work, Civilization and Its Discontents. I don't know if you've read it, but maybe actually that's a good one for our reading list. If you guys haven't read it in the group setting, it's a great work. But one of the key points that Freud makes there is that modern dilemma is this or us being stuck between a rock and a hard place. And the rock is we want culture, we want civilization to prevent us from killing each other and having suffering and so on. But on the other side, that leads to all of our vital instincts being hemmed in by that same exact device. And so we're constantly being hammered from the two sides. One is the fear of suffering and bad experiences from other men and nature and so on. The other is the more we protect ourselves from each other and from nature, the less we are in touch with the world and with life. And that actually ties very neatly with the idea of pessimism and optimism. An optimist is a person who can say, I am fully protected. I'm protected by law, by the things I've built around me that protect me from fluctuations in nature and the chaos of nature and so on. But of course, the more we do that, the less we are able to experience the rawness of that life. And maybe, it has its benefits for sure. That's why we did it. But the other side of it is the neuroses that we get because we're no longer in touch with the experience of life. What Freud doesn't mention in his work is art as a potential cathartic solution to this, where it is, in fact, a way to channel some of these energies, some of the frustration, some of the pent-up, unrealized suffering that is real nonetheless. It's not material, but it's real, into some kind of artistic medium. And I think Nietzsche possibly gives us an outlet there.
Thank you, Phil. Folks, on this discussion of metaphors and poetry, I did a meetup on metaphors of water, fruit, and word. So, and we're going to continue on the theme of the word and what are the various meanings of word and how the metaphors work in word tomorrow. In the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the word. So we're going to be talking about that tomorrow. All right. Phil, can you give us a preview of what you're doing a month from now in this series?
Yeah, so we're going to continue to the end of this work, reading sections 14 through the end, and we'll just talk about the delving in more into the Socratic influences on tragedy, its demise, and the rest of the story, so to speak.
Wonderful. Thank you. Let's see. On these Comprehensivist Wednesdays, we rotate. The first Comprehensivist Wednesday of the month is always improv. The second is some idea of Bucky. And Maritza, what idea of Bucky are we going to do this time?
Trim tab. We're going to discuss the principle of trim tab.
Okay, can you just explain in a sentence or two what trim tab is for people who are not familiar with Bucky?
It's the fin on a ship that's a stabilizing force.
Wonderful, thank you. It's basically when you want to change the ship, you have this rudder. Trim tab is this little rudder to the rudder. So it's a way of point of maximum leverage. If you want to change the direction of this massive ship, it's this little thing that changes the rudder, that changes the direction of the whole thing. So it's the point of maximum leverage, which Bucky talks about quite eloquently. So that, don't miss that. Next, go ahead, Marisa.
No, I was just going to say, the appropriate definition would be it's the idea that small changes at the right time and place can have a significant impact on the direction of larger systems.
Wonderful. Next, we're going to, on the third Wednesday, we do neuroscience. And Sanjay has been doing this incredible series on that. And fourth, of course, we have Phil. And Phil, after this Nietzsche, can you just rattle off the other ones that you're going to do on history and language? Just the names.
I don't have it in front of me, but we're gonna do gosh,
just the topic. So we're going to look at
so we're gonna do linguistics and some thoughts on my God,
that's
symbols in language. You caught me.
Yeah, sorry about that. But anyway, so I'm just delighted with.
It's getting late. All of our brains are kind of in a haze now.
Yes, he's becoming more Dionysian.
Right, exactly.
And he has a bottle of wine stacked away to fully celebrate that.
Exactly.
Wonderful. But anyway, I'm just I'm tremendously grateful for all these new things that you brought to us. Everything on language has been just spectacular, and I'm delighted that you brought Nietzsche. Nietzsche is always so deeply thought-provoking, just always blows me away. All right, folks, thank you very much. We will see you soon. Oh, wait a minute, I have to tell you, we've got 3 meetups this Sunday. We're going to do Antigone at 5 o'clock. We're going to do Social Tensegrity by Richard Ramsey at 9 p.m. and 2 p.m. The gentleman with Peter Berkman, who works with Center for Digital Life, is going to come, and he's going to be talking about his overview of Gospel of John. I've been wanting to talk to him about it. He really knows stuff very well, and so I'll just have a conversation with him, and then everybody can ask questions. So that's the plan for the Sunday, and then Mondays are, of course, Poetry Mondays. Then Tuesdays, we're doing Art of War. That series is going amazingly well. So stop by whenever you want. Bye, everybody.